Welcome to part 2 of making this needle felted husky. In this portion we're going to be focusing on building up the body. If you already have a really good familiarity with needle felting, you can probably skip this portion of the tutorial and maybe just look at the very end of it in terms of where I'm at with the dog and where I've built up the bulk in the body. But otherwise, this is really intended for people to follow along if you just really want to see exactly where I put the wool. This doesn't really skip anything. It's just going to show how I built up the body of this husky. And the next portion of the tutorial will start to show how to build the paws. So this is just working on building up more bulk onto the body. One thing to keep in mind is I'm going to try to really make sure that this is very densely felted because I'm planning to achieve the look of this fluffy coat by doing reverse felting. So one of the things I'm going to keep working on is making sure that I have fully felted the body of this dog. This is just to show the overall thickness that I have so far for the dog. So I'm just showing some different angles just so you have an idea of about how thick I have it built up. Now I'm going to start working on building up a little bit more bulk on the legs. And again, you want to err on the side of keeping the legs too thin rather than too thick. So this is actually a fairly thin piece of wool. And again, I'm wrapping it and just holding it in place with my fingertips, and then I will felt it in place. It's good to try to make sure it's kind of thin and not lumpy when you wrap it. As I wrap this hind leg, I will allow for there to be more bulk on the upper portions of the leg where it's more muscular and fluffy. But on that very lower part of the leg, it needs to stay very thin. And one way to really keep it thin is to just I'm actually applying quite a bit of tension to the wool and pulling against it as I wrap it. So at this point, I've only built up the bulk on the legs of the right side of the dog. you can compare it with the dog's left side and see that it hasn't been built up yet. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and I'll make them match. And here I'm going to jump to working on the dog's head. So I'm taking some wool and I'm going to roll it into a ball, and then I will felt it fairly tightly just so that there is a base to start working with for the head. But I think this is actually a little bit too much wool, and it made it a little more difficult to work with. It's always easier to add more wool than to have too much wool and then have to really work at felting it down. So I would recommend making a smaller size ball than this. This took a lot of felting. And all I'm going to do is sort of wrap that bulk around the head. And again, this really was probably too much wool to use to wrap it, so I would recommend starting with less than this. This was too thick of a piece. I still made it work, but it did require a lot more felting than it would have if I had just used a smaller amount and then maybe just built up as I needed. Because there's so much wool on the head, I'm having to really press. You can see the discoloration in my fingertip there. I'm trying to really squeeze the air out and then felt it in place to compress it more, which if you don't add quite so much wool, you probably won't have to do quite so much of that. This portion of the head doesn't include the muzzle at all. This is all just going to be like the back part of the skull, and then the eyes will fit basically right in the front of this, and I will build the muzzle on afterward. So this is really just a lot of compressing the wool and getting it to felt very tightly and checking it, and then just continuing to get it really tightly felted. Here I turned the head a little by squeezing tightly and bending that wire because I want the dog to be facing a little bit toward its left. Now I'm taking some of the wool and I'm just going to build up the shoulder a little bit more. There's going to be a lot of just building up the musculature of the dog, little bits at a time, just taking wool wherever it's looking too thin or the muscles aren't really showing or just doesn't look right, and just keep adding wool and filling out the dog's body. There are a few short portions of time-lapse video that I recorded, mainly because it is a lot smaller file and easier for me to load on my computer. And some of this is just, it takes a long time to build up the bulk of the animal. So I will try to mark it where it's time-lapse, because I understand that you won't really be able to slow it down in YouTube and get much more detail, but I was just trying to show the overall transformation and where the bulk is being built up. Next, I'm taking some actually bright white wool roving, and I'm gonna start adding color in the places that I pretty much built up as thick as I need to. And I wanna make sure that I get the color laid on in a few layers of thickness, since I will be reverse felting. So everywhere that I'm gonna add color to the dog that I plan to reverse felt, it will have several layers of color added onto the body. Here I'm taking some of that same white roving, and I'm kind of pre-felting it a little bit in my fingertips, just rolling it, and then I'm going to start adding it to the fronts of the feet so that we will start to have a base for a paw. You might notice that I have this white needle that I'm using right now. This one is the same as my yellow needle, except that it has a shorter length to the needle itself, which helps it be a little more sturdy and less likely to break. There is wire just on the other side of where I'm felting, but I didn't want to use the big bulky needle, so this one's finer. I believe it's a 40T, but it's a special one that's short. It's just a short length. I'm just doing something similar on the hind paws. I'm just going to keep building up the front of the foot with the white wool so that there's some soft wool there that I can use to build the paw. Next, I'm taking some of that white wool and I'm going to start covering the legs with white. This dog does have white legs, so I will be trying to lay the wool in a direction now that doesn't give it that wrapped look, and just make it look more natural, like the direction that the hair grows. This blue needle is my finest needle. It's a 42T, and so it's very thin, and that does make it easy for getting the wool to felt. If the wool starts to become very dense, this is going to be able to poke in easier. But also the reason I'm using it is because it's so fine, there won't be as many visible poking marks, the holes that the needles leave behind in the wool. So I wanted to make the legs look a little more smooth and natural and not look as needle felted. So that's why I'm using that one. And actually this one has a similar function, it's just it's a little bit thicker. I think it's a 38, it might be a 40, but it's a star shaped. I need to I'll put that in the description. I'll look up what the red one is, but the red one has a star shape, which just helps to reduce the amount of visible holes that you see left by the needle itself. I'm just trying to create this little bit of a crease in the foreleg, and I did use a different needle, but it's not critical that you use this needle. The equivalent would be the purple needle if you were interested